Richard Beaumont thought his son-in-law, Ethan, was a failure. He didn't know that the very foundation of his opulent life, the polished marble floors he stood on and the crystal glass he held, were all owned by the very man he so openly despised. Within 3 months, the laughter echoing in his grand hall would turn to desperate pleas, and the man he had tried to break would be the only one who could save him. The scene was one of perfectly orchestrated schadenfreude. Richard and his family were masters of the art. Do you know people like that? People who seem to draw their own strength from the perceived weakness of others. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know if this feeling is universal. For now, if you enjoy stories where the patient and the principled finally get their due, you might want to like this video and subscribe, because the journey we're about to take is a long and satisfying one. The Beaumont's sprawling mansion was ablaze with light, a beacon of self-congratulatory excess in the manicured heart of the city's most exclusive neighborhood. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of smug conversation. Richard Beaumont, patriarch and high priest of this temple of materialism, raised his glass, a heavy, intricate piece of crystal. It caught the chandelier's light and fractured it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. To family, Richard boomed, his voice a practiced instrument of authority. His eyes, small and hard like polished river stones, swept across the gathered clan. They were all there. His wife, Eleanor, a woman whose spine seemed to be forged from the same steel as her social ambition, smiled a taut, approving smile. His son, Gregory, a younger, cruder-edged copy of his father, grinned with the easy cruelty of a man who had never faced a real consequence. And his daughter, Sophia, Ethan's wife, stood slightly apart, her expression a carefully neutral mask that failed to hide the flicker of unease in her eyes. And to new beginnings, Richard continued, his gaze finally landing on Ethan, who stood quietly near the edge of the circle. The comment was a blade, and its target was clear. To shedding dead weight and embracing a future of appropriate success. A wave of sycophantic laughter rippled through the room. Gregory clapped Ethan on the shoulder with a force that was more of a blow than a gesture of camaraderie. Don't worry, Ethan, old boy. Every family needs its cautionary tale. You're playing the part beautifully. Ethan offered a small, unreadable smile. He felt the familiar weight in his jacket pocket, the smooth, cylindrical shape of his favorite fountain pen. It was a simple object, a Lamy 2000, known for its understated design and flawless engineering. To the Beaumonts, it would look like a cheap affectation. To Ethan, it was a symbol. It was the tool with which he had designed soaring structures of glass and steel, and it was the instrument with which he had signed the documents that now lay sleeping, like a dragon, beneath the Beaumonts' gilded world. He said nothing. His silence was a canvas onto which they painted their own assumptions of his defeat. He was, in their eyes, a fallen man. Just 2 weeks prior, the news had broken. The prestigious architectural firm where Ethan was a senior partner had lost the Blackwood Tower contract, a project that was meant to be his crowning achievement. The story, as Richard had gleefully shared it with anyone who would listen, was that Ethan's artsy, impractical designs had been rejected, costing the firm millions and leading to his effective dismissal. He was now, supposedly unemployed and facing financial ruin. Sophia shifted beside him, the rustle of her silk dress a sound of pure anxiety. She looked at her father, then at her husband, her face a portrait of conflicted loyalties. She wanted to defend him, a part of her did, but the gravitational pull of her family's expectations was immense. To stand with Ethan now was to stand against everything she had ever known. Status, security, the effortless glide through life that came with the Beaumont name. And so she remained silent. A silent enabler, her inaction a quiet but devastating betrayal. Ethan registered her silence. He cataloged it, filed it away with the other slights, the other moments of casual cruelty. He was an architect of systems, not just of buildings. He understood that relationships, like structures, had load-bearing walls and breaking points. He was methodically testing the integrity of the edifice around him. Well, enough of the dreary stuff, Eleanor chirped, her voice gliding over the tension like a skater over thin ice. Gregory, darling, tell us about the new acquisition for the company. Something to celebrate. Gregory puffed out his chest. Dad and I just closed on the old textile district downtown. Going to level it, put up some high-end condos. We got it for a song. Richard beamed. The fools who owned it were leveraged to the hilt. Their holding company folded overnight. Just swooped in and picked the carcass clean. That's how the game is played, Ethan. You see, you have to be the shark, not the guppy. He winked, as if sharing a profound secret of the universe. Ethan's calm expression didn't waver. His mind, however, was a whirlwind of activity. He pictured the organizational charts he had studied for weeks, the web of LLCs and shell corporations. He knew exactly which holding company had folded. He knew because he had been the one to acquire its controlling interest quietly through a subsidiary of a subsidiary. The textile district wasn't just a random acquisition for the Beaumonts. It was the final, crucial piece of a much larger puzzle Ethan was assembling. The Beaumonts thought they were sharks. They had no idea they were swimming in his aquarium. He felt Sophia's hand tentatively find his. A small, desperate gesture. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned to look at her, his eyes clear and direct. He didn't offer false reassurances. He didn't lash out. He simply stated a fact. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The answer confused her. It was not the response of a broken man. But before she could question him, Richard's voice cut through the air again, summoning them to the dining room for a feast in honor of their own success, a celebration built upon the foundations of what they believed was his failure. As Ethan walked toward the long, polished mahogany table, he felt the cool, reassuring weight of the pen in his pocket. The plans were drawn. The foundation was set. All he had to do now was wait for the right moment to build. The Beaumonts were about to receive an education in architecture, a lesson in how quickly a house of cards can fall when its true owner decides to reclaim the property. The first act of this theatrical humiliation was over. The slow, methodical construction of their downfall was just beginning. The campaign of condescension had begun, as these things often do, around a dinner table. It was the Tuesday after the news about the Blackwood Tower project had become public knowledge, or at least the Beaumonts' distorted version of it. Sophia had insisted they attend the family's weekly dinner, arguing that not showing up would be seen as an admission of defeat. "We have to keep up appearances, Ethan," she had said, her voice strained. Ethan, who had no interest in appearances but every interest in observing the full scope of the Beaumonts' character, had agreed without argument. The dining room was Richard's inner sanctum, a stage set for his weekly performance as the magnanimous patriarch. A long, imposing table of dark wood, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the cold light of a crystal chandelier. The meal was, as always, catered. The Beaumonts did not cook. They curated experiences. Ethan took his seat, noting the subtle but deliberate shift in the seating arrangement. He had always been placed next to Sophia, near the center of the table. Tonight he was relegated to the far end, next to a perpetually vacant chair used for overflow guests, a physical manifestation of his newly diminished status. Richard began the evening with his usual pronouncements on the state of the market, his pronouncements laced with barely veiled references to Ethan's situation. "It's a brutal world out there," he declared, carving a slice of roast beef with surgical precision. "No room for dreamers. You have to be a pragmatist, a realist. Isn't that right, Gregory?" "Absolutely, Dad," Gregory chimed in, his mouth full. "You see these architects, these visionaries, they draw pretty pictures. But they don't understand the bottom line. They design things that can't be built on budget. It's a liability." His eyes flicked toward Ethan for a fraction of a second, a glint of malicious satisfaction in them. Ethan calmly placed his napkin on his lap. His mind was not on the insult, it was on the irony. Gregory, who had barely passed his business degree and whose primary contribution to the family company was his surname, was lecturing him on pragmatism. Ethan, whose pretty pictures had won international awards for structural efficiency and innovative material use, was being framed as impractical. Eleanor, ever the social conductor, steered the conversation with practiced ease. "Sophia, darling," she began, her tone dripping with false concern, "we were so worried when we heard the news. You must be under terrible strain, you know. Your father and I are always here for you. You never have to feel trapped in a situation." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Trapped. The word was a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of his marriage. Ethan watched Sophia's reaction. A flush crept up her neck. She picked at her food, her eyes fixed on her plate. "We're fine, Mother," she mumbled. "Ethan is resilient. He'll find something else." Her defense was weak, tentative. It was the plea of a hostage, not the defiant roar of a partner. Ethan felt a pang, not of anger, but of a deep, sorrowful disappointment. He had known Sophia's family was obsessed with status, but he had believed her to be different, to possess an inner strength that could withstand their corrosive influence. He was now seeing the first cracks in that belief. It was then that Richard turned his full attention to Ethan, a predator finally deciding to engage with its cornered prey. "So Ethan," he said, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin, "what's the plan? I assume architecture is off the table for now. Takes a certain kind of grit. I might have a position opening up in our logistics department, warehouse management. It's not glamorous, but it's a steady paycheck. We have to look after family after all." The offer was a masterpiece of condescension. It was not kindness, it was a power play, designed to formally establish the new hierarchy. Richard the benefactor, Ethan the supplicant. He would be an employee, a subordinate, a constant, living reminder of his own failure, paraded around the Beaumont offices for all to see. The table fell silent. All eyes were on Ethan. This was the moment they were waiting for, the moment he was supposed to break, to show gratitude, to accept his diminished place in their world. Ethan took a slow sip of water. He met Richard's gaze across the long expanse of polished wood. He didn't look angry or humiliated. He looked analytical, as if he were examining a curious specimen. "Richard," he began, his voice even and calm, "that is a remarkably generous offer." A smug smile played on Richard's lips. He had won. "However," Ethan continued, "I'm afraid I'll have to decline. I'm currently exploring a new venture, something in asset management and strategic acquisition. It requires a significant amount of my attention." Gregory snorted into his wine glass. "Asset management? What assets are you managing, Ethan? Your collection of broken pencils?" The laughter was immediate and harsh. Ethan let it wash over him. He felt the pen in his pocket, a solid, grounding weight. He thought of the file folder in his briefcase at home. It was labeled Project Chimera. Inside were the meticulously organized plans for the hostile takeover of Beaumont Industries' primary creditor, a mid-sized, obscure financial institution called Argent Trust. He had finalized the last of the share purchases that very morning. The assets he was managing were in fact theirs. They just didn't know it yet. "Something like that," Ethan replied, a ghost of a smile on his lips. He picked up his fork and began to eat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The family exchanged confused glances. His response was not on their script. He was supposed to be desperate, not dismissive. His calm was unnerving, a quiet note of dissonance in their symphony of superiority. They mistook it for arrogance, the last gasp of a proud man in denial. They couldn't comprehend that it was the profound, unshakable calm of a man who had already won the game and was simply watching the other players move their pieces toward an inevitable checkmate. Sophia stared at him from across the table, a new emotion warring with the anxiety in her eyes. Confusion. Who was this man? This quiet, contained stranger who sat where her husband should be. For the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt, not about Ethan's prospects, but about the narrative her family had so carefully constructed. It was a tiny flicker, easily extinguished, but it was there, and Ethan, who noticed everything, noticed that too. The first humiliation was complete. It had served its purpose perfectly. It had established their position, revealed their tactics, and exposed the weakness in his own marital flank. The data was collected. The next phase could begin. The weeks that followed the disastrous dinner were a masterclass in escalating psychological warfare. The Beaumonts, emboldened by what they perceived as Ethan's delusional denial, intensified their campaign to isolate and humiliate him. They seemed to believe that if they repeated the story of his failure often enough, with enough conviction, they could make it his reality. The charity gala was the pinnacle of this effort, a public crucifixion disguised as a black tie event. It was the Beaumont Foundation's annual centerpiece, held at the city's most prestigious museum. The event was Eleanor's domain, a carefully stage-managed affair designed to showcase the family's philanthropy, which was in reality a tool for social climbing and tax avoidance. Ethan had tried to bow out, but Sophia had been insistent. "We have to go," she'd pleaded. "It would be a declaration of war if we didn't. Just stay by my side. Keep your head down." From the moment they arrived, it was clear that keeping a low profile was not an option the Beaumonts intended to afford him. The valet, clearly pre-instructed, feigned confusion over their name before finding it on a secondary, less important list. As they walked in, Richard was holding court with a city councilman and a prominent developer. He saw them approach and, with theatrical flourish, turned his back, drawing his companions with him into a tight, exclusionary circle. The message was clear: "You are not welcome here." Ethan felt Sophia's fingers tighten on his arm. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, though he knew it was a hollow gesture. Throughout the grand hall, he could feel the eyes of the Beaumonts' social circle upon them, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They had all been fed the official story. He was the architect who flew too close to the sun, the embarrassing husband of the lovely Sophia Beaumont. Gregory found them by the silent auction tables. He was slightly drunk, his face flushed with the cheap confidence of inherited wealth. "Ethan, I was wondering if you'd show your face," he slurred, draping an arm heavily over Ethan's shoulders. "Brave of you, I'll give you that." He gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings. "Bit different from the unemployment line, eh? Listen, I was talking to a few people. Might be able to get you a job driving for one of the livery services we use. You know cars, right? You put gas in them. You point them in the right direction. Can't be much harder than designing buildings that fall over." The insult was so crude, so utterly lacking in wit, that it was almost comical. But the intent was pure venom. It was designed to provoke a reaction, to make Ethan lose his composure in this public forum, thereby proving their narrative that he was unstable and unprofessional. Ethan slowly, deliberately removed Gregory's arm from his shoulder. He looked him directly in the eye. His own gaze was as cool and placid as a deep lake. "Gregory," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority that startled the younger man. "You're drunk, and you're making a fool of yourself. Go and get a glass of water." For a moment, Gregory was too stunned to reply. No one, least of all Ethan, had ever spoken to him with such direct, unadorned condescension. He was about to retort with a string of inherited insults when he saw something in Ethan's eyes that gave him pause. It wasn't anger. It was something far more unnerving. It was pity. Ethan turned his back on him and walked away, leaving Gregory sputtering in his wake. He found a quiet corner overlooking the museum's sculpture garden, the cool moonlight illuminating the stark, clean lines of the modern art. He preferred the company of the silent, stoic statues. He pulled his phone from his pocket, ignoring the glittering spectacle inside. He opened a secure messaging app and typed a quick note to a contact named A. Finch. Phase 2 asset secured. Initiate transfer protocol for Argent Trust. Acknowledge. Almost immediately, a reply came back. Acknowledged. The board is yours as of 0900 tomorrow. Congratulations, Ethelred. Ethelred, it was the name he used for his private holding company, a nod to the ill-advised Saxon king. It amused him, Etherd the unready. He, however, was anything but. He slipped the phone back into his pocket just as Sophia found him. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions. "What did you say to Gregory?" she demanded, her voice a harsh whisper. "He's furious. He told Dad you threatened him." Ethan turned to face her, his posture relaxed. "I told him he was drunk and that he should get some water." A statement of fact and a piece of friendly advice. "You know that's not how they'll see it." "You're making things worse, Ethan. Why can't you just be humble for a little while? Let this blow over." The word humble struck him. They didn't want him to be humble. They wanted him to be humiliated. There was a difference. Humility was a virtue. Humiliation was a weapon they were wielding against him. "Sophia," he said, his voice losing its detached calm for the first time, replaced by a note of genuine inquiry. "What do you believe? Do you believe I'm a failure? Do you believe your brother's version of events?" She faltered. "It's not that simple. My family, they're just concerned." "They're not concerned," Ethan stated flatly. "They are enjoying this. And you are letting them." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet, unassailable truth of his words was more powerful than any shout. He watched her absorb the statement, saw the flicker of denial, followed by the dawning, painful recognition of its accuracy. "I don't know what to do," she finally whispered, her shoulders slumping. "For now, you don't have to do anything," he said, his voice softening again. He reached out and straightened the strap of her gown. "Let's just get through the evening." But as they walked back into the throng of people, a subtle shift had occurred. His calm was no longer merely unnerving to her. It was becoming a source of mystery, a puzzle she couldn't solve. She had watched him absorb the worst her family could throw at him, not with anger or despair, but with a kind of detached, analytical patience. He wasn't acting like a man who had lost everything. He was acting like a man who was playing an entirely different game, on a board she couldn't even see. And for the first time, she felt a genuine sliver of fear, not for Ethan, but of him. The second act of his public shaming had failed to produce the desired effect. It had, instead, planted a seed of doubt in the one person whose loyalty the Beaumonts had taken for granted. The foundations of their own house were beginning to show the faintest of stress fractures. The third and most vicious attack came not in public, but in the calculated intimacy of the Beaumonts' own living room. It was a summons, delivered by Eleanor via a curt phone call to Sophia a week after the gala. "Your father and I need to speak with you both. It's an intervention," she had declared, leaving no room for refusal. Ethan knew what was coming. This was the escalation he had anticipated, the move from public mockery to a direct assault on his marriage. They had tried to break his spirit and failed. Now they would try to sever his last remaining tie to their world, his wife. He walked into the lion's den willingly, his mind clear and his purpose fixed. The Beaumont mansion felt different in the stark light of a Sunday afternoon. Without the crowds and the champagne, its opulence seemed cold and sterile, a museum of wealth rather than a home. Richard and Eleanor were seated in matching high-backed armchairs, positioned like thrones in front of a cold, cavernous fireplace. They did not rise when Ethan and Sophia entered. "Sophia, sit," Richard commanded, pointing to a sofa opposite them. He ignored Ethan completely. "We need to talk about your future." Sophia sat, her hands clenched in her lap. Ethan remained standing, a silent, watchful presence by the door. His refusal to sit was a small act of defiance, a rejection of their staged courtroom. "This has gone on long enough," Eleanor began, her voice devoid of its usual social grace, stripped down to raw, parental authority. "Sophia, We have watched you stand by this man as he has dragged your name, our name, through the mud. His professional collapse is now complete. His behavior at the gala was appalling. He is a liability in every sense of the word. He didn't do anything, Sophia started, her voice trembling slightly. He did nothing, Richard cut in, his voice a low growl. And that's the problem. He does nothing. He produces nothing. He is nothing. We have been patient. We have been generous. I offered him a job, for God's sake, a chance to retain a shred of dignity. And he threw it back in my face with some fantasy about asset management. He finally turned his gaze on Ethan. It was filled with pure, unadulterated contempt. Let me be clear, Ethan. This is not a negotiation. This is a statement of fact. You are not fit to be my daughter's husband. You cannot provide for her. You cannot protect her status. You are a weight pulling her down. Ethan met his gaze without flinching. Inside his mind, a cold, clear process was running. He was cross-referencing the speech with a mental list he had been compiling for months. Dragged our name through the mud, check. Professional collapse, check. Not fit to be my daughter's husband, check. Each insult was a data point. Each accusation a piece of evidence he would later present to the court of their own making. We have retained a lawyer on Sophia's behalf, Eleanor announced, dropping the words like stones into a pond. One of the best divorce attorneys in the state. He will ensure the separation is clean, and that you walk away with exactly what you came into this marriage with. Nothing, Sophia gasped. Mother, you didn't. We did what was necessary, Richard said, his voice softening as he looked at his daughter. We are protecting you, darling, from him, and from your own misguided loyalty. This was the moment, the precipice, the point where Sophia had to make a choice. She could stand with her family and their cold, transactional view of the world, or she could stand with her husband, the man she had promised to love in good times and in bad. Ethan watched her, his expression unreadable. He did not prompt her. He did not plead. He gave her the dignity and the burden of a free choice. The silence in the room stretched, taut and thin. Sophia looked at her parents. Seated like monarchs on their velvet thrones, she saw the absolute certainty in their eyes, the unshakable belief in their own rightness. Then she looked at Ethan. He was just standing there, his hands loosely in his pockets, his posture relaxed. He looked tired, perhaps, but not defeated. He looked like a man waiting for a train, patient and sure of its eventual arrival. In that moment, the seed of doubt that had been planted at the gala began to sprout. No, she said, her voice small but firm. Richard's eyebrows shot up. What did you say? I said no, Sophia repeated, gaining strength. She stood up, moving to stand beside Ethan. It was not a large distance. Just a few feet, but it was a journey across a vast emotional chasm. You will not hire a lawyer. You will not speak to my husband this way. We will handle our own affairs. Richard's face purpled with rage. He has nothing, Sophia. Can you not see that? He is a failed architect living off your family's good name. Before Ethan could stop himself, a small dry chuckle escaped his lips. It was a quiet sound, but in the tense silence of the room, it was like a gunshot. You find this amusing? Richard roared, getting to his feet. I do, actually, Ethan said, his voice calm and steady. I find it profoundly amusing. You stand here in this house, a house whose mortgage payments I know for a fact are 3 months behind. You lecture me on financial stability from a company, Beaumont Industries, that is leveraged at a ratio of 9-to-1 and has been operating at a net loss for 3 consecutive quarters. You talk about my failure when my failed firm, even after the loss of the Blackwood contract, posted a higher profit margin last year than your entire conglomerate. He was not shouting. He was stating facts, cold, hard, verifiable facts that he had learned during his due diligence for Project Chimera. Richard and Eleanor stared at him, momentarily stunned into silence. They had no idea how he could possibly know these things. They were private, shameful secrets, hidden behind layers of creative accounting. Those are vicious lies, Eleanor hissed, recovering first. Are they? Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. He reached into his jacket pocket and his fingers brushed against the cool metal and resin of his pen. He didn't take it out, not yet. You see, that's the problem with judging a book by its cover, Richard. You assumed my story was a tragedy. You were so eager for it to be a tragedy. It never occurred to you that it might be a strategy. He turned to Sophia. Let's go home. He walked out of the room without a backward glance. Sophia, after a moment of stunned hesitation, followed him, leaving her parents standing speechless in the center of their cold, opulent, and deeply indebted living room. The drive home was silent. Sophia kept stealing glances at him, her mind reeling, the numbers, the ratios, the confidence with which he had spoken. It was the language of a man in complete control, not a man on the brink of ruin. The third humiliation had been intended for him. But as the door to the Beaumont mansion closed behind them, it was clear that the true humiliation had been borne by its owners. They had revealed their entire strategy, exposed their deepest fears, and in return had received the first terrifying glimpse of the man their son-in-law truly was, the quiet before the storm was over. The first drops of rain had begun to fall. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the Beaumont estate were characterized by a strange and unsettling quiet. It was the kind of deep, ringing silence that follows a massive explosion, when the air itself seems to be holding its breath. The Beaumonts, for the first time in Ethan's memory, went completely quiet. There were no more condescending phone calls, no more passive-aggressive invitations, no more public ambushes. They had retreated, stunned by the unexpected volley of financial details Ethan had fired at them. Their silence was not one of reflection, however, but of regrouping. They believed Ethan had somehow gotten lucky, that he had stumbled upon some damaging information and used it in a desperate bluff. They couldn't conceive of a reality where his knowledge was comprehensive and his position was one of overwhelming strength. In the quiet of his own home, Ethan was the opposite of silent. He was a man of methodical, purposeful action. The grand, theatrical confrontations were over for now. This was the phase he truly excelled at, the meticulous, behind-the-scenes execution of a complex plan. His home office, once a space for dreaming up elegant skylines, had become a war room. The drafting table was covered not with blueprints for buildings, but with organizational charts and financial statements, a dense forest of paper through which he moved with the quiet confidence of a master strategist. He was on the phone constantly, but his conversations were brief, calm, and cryptic. He spoke in a kind of code, referencing project names and phase numbers. A. Finch, his contact, was a frequent correspondent. Their messages were a staccato exchange of confirmations. Project Chimera complete. Argent Trust Board is seated. Full control confirmed. Initiate Project Griffin. Begin acquisition of Beaumont's secondary suppliers. Griffin Phase 1 complete. Supply chain leverage established. Sophia watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The husband she thought she knew, the quiet, thoughtful architect who sometimes seemed lost in his own world of lines and angles, had been replaced by a man of formidable, almost frightening, focus. He moved with an economy of motion, a purposefulness that seemed to draw energy from some deep, hidden wellspring. She tried to ask him about it once. "Ethan, what is all this? The phone calls, the papers? What's happening?" He had paused, looked up from a complex spreadsheet, and given her a gentle smile. "I'm building something, Sophia. It's just a different kind of architecture." He then pointed to a line of numbers. "You see this? This is a load-bearing wall. And this," he pointed to another, "is a facade. Your father's business has too much of the latter and not enough of the former. I'm just making some structural assessments." The answer was both illuminating and utterly mystifying. She didn't press further. For the first time in their marriage, she sensed she was out of her depth, and she decided to trust him, not out of blind loyalty, but because his quiet competence was more compelling than her family's loud, brittle arrogance. She began to help in small ways, bringing him coffee, organizing his files into neat stacks, becoming a silent partner in a venture she did not understand but was beginning to believe in. Meanwhile, the Beaumonts were living in a fool's paradise. After their initial shock, their arrogance reasserted itself. They convinced themselves that Ethan's outburst was the last desperate act of a drowning man. They began to mock his asset management fantasy amongst themselves. "Can you believe the nerve?" Richard would say over dinner, a little too loudly. Spouting nonsense he probably read in a magazine. The boy's gone mad. Gregory, ever the echo, would add, "He's probably sitting in his little apartment right now, drawing up plans for a new doghouse. It's all he's qualified for." They doubled down on their lavish lifestyle, as if to prove to the world and to themselves that they were untouchable. Eleanor threw a lavish garden party. Richard bought a new sports car, a gleaming silver beast, that he drove with aggressive look-at-me pride. Gregory closed a deal on a gaudy new watch that cost more than most people's annual salary. Each purchase was a broadcast, a signal of their own perceived invulnerability. They were fiddling while their Rome was being quietly, systematically purchased. Ethan observed all of this from a distance. He had alerts set up for their social media, for news mentions of their company. He saw the pictures of the new car, the gushing society page write-up of Eleanor's party. He felt no anger, only a kind of clinical detachment. They were providing him with more evidence, more justification for what was to come. Each act of hubris was another nail they were hammering into their own coffin. The final piece of his plan was the most elegant and the most personal. It involved their home, the sprawling mansion that was the very symbol of their identity. He had discovered, during his deep dive into their finances, that the house was not owned by them outright, nor was it held by their primary company. It was owned by a standalone LLC, Beaumont Manor Holdings, for tax and liability purposes. The mortgage on that LLC was held by a small regional bank. Through a series of discrete transactions, using a subsidiary of Ethered Holdings so obscure it barely had a name, Ethan's company bought that bank. It was a small, almost insignificant acquisition in the grand scheme of his new empire, but it was the one that mattered most to him on a personal level. After the acquisition was complete, he had the bank call in the loan, citing the 3 months of missed payments as a breach of contract. The Beaumonts, suddenly faced with a massive balloon payment they couldn't possibly afford, were forced to seek a new lender. And that was when Mr. Alistair Finch made his move. Acting as a representative for a private, anonymous investor, he contacted Richard's lawyers and offered to buy the mortgage outright, consolidating their debt under new, more favorable terms. Richard, desperate to avoid the humiliation of a public foreclosure on his sacred mansion, jumped at the chance. He signed the papers without reading the fine print, relieved to have found a faceless, silent financial entity to solve his problem. He had no idea he was handing the deed to his kingdom over to the very man he had cast out of it. One cool autumn evening, about 3 months after the initial downfall, Ethan sat in his office and looked at the final document that had just been couriered over. It was the title deed to the Beaumont mansion. His name wasn't on it, of course. The owner was listed as Ethered Holdings. He picked up his Lamy 2000 fountain pen, the same pen he had used to sketch the initial designs for the Blackwood Tower. He unscrewed the cap and placed it neatly on his desk. Then, with a steady hand, he opened his personal journal. He didn't write about finance or strategy. He wrote a single sentence: "It is time to call the meeting." He closed the journal, capped his pen, and walked into the living room where Sophia was reading. "I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice calm. "I need you to call your family. Tell them I have requested a meeting at their house, tomorrow evening at 7. Tell them it's to discuss our future." Sophia looked up, her eyes wide. She saw the look on his face, the look of an architect who was about to unveil his masterpiece. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll call them." The quiet was over. The storm was about to break. The air in the Beaumont mansion was thick with a toxic cocktail of anticipation and contempt. Ethan and Sophia arrived at precisely 7 o'clock. The front door was opened by a stern-faced Eleanor, who did not greet them but simply turned and led them toward the living room where Richard and Gregory were waiting. The family was presenting a united front, a tribunal ready to pass judgment. They believed this meeting was Ethan's final surrender, the moment he would come, hat in hand, to beg for a peaceful divorce, perhaps even for the pittance of a settlement they had no intention of giving. They had arranged the room as they had before, with Richard and Gregory seated in the large armchairs, creating a clear power dynamic. They had left the small, uncomfortable sofa for Ethan and Sophia. It was a petty but deliberate piece of staging. Ethan ignored the intended seating arrangement. He walked to the center of the room, standing on the intricate pattern of the expensive Persian rug, a space that forced them all to look at him. Sophia, after a moment's hesitation, stood with him, a quiet but significant show of solidarity. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Ethan began, his voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. "Let's not waste time with pleasantries, Ethan," Richard grumbled, waving a dismissive hand. "We know why you're here. Sophia has made her misguided choice to stand by you, and now you've come to see what you can get. So, what is it? You want us to fund your next little venture? You want a clean break with a small payout to keep you quiet? Let's hear it. What's your price for disappearing from our lives?" Gregory chuckled, a low, nasty sound. "Be careful, Dad. His asset management firm might be about to make a big move. Maybe he wants to sell us a pencil." Ethan let the insults land and dissolve in the silence that followed. He did not rise to the bait. Instead, he looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering for a moment before moving on. It was not a glare, it was an assessment. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Ethan said, his voice retaining its unnerving calm. "I'm here to provide some clarity, to close the loop on a few conversations we've had over the past few months." He turned his attention to Gregory. "Gregory, you may not remember the charity gala clearly, but I do. You suggested I get a job as a driver. You said, and I quote, 'You put gas in them, you point them in the right direction.' Can't be much harder than designing buildings that fall over." It was a crude attempt at humor, but it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of my work. My buildings don't fall over. They are known for their structural integrity. It is a principle I apply to all my endeavors. Gregory shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the sneer on his face faltering slightly. Ethan then turned to Eleanor. "Eleanor, you told my wife you were worried she felt trapped in a situation. You offered her the services of a divorce attorney to protect her from me. You saw my supposed unemployment not as a challenge for us to face together, but as an opportunity to enforce your own social and financial standards on her life. You judged my worthiness as a husband based solely on a temporary, and as it turns out, manufactured career setback. Eleanor's lips thinned into a hard white line. We were only thinking of our daughter's happiness, were you? Ethan asked, the question soft but sharp. Or were you thinking of the inconvenience of having a failed son-in-law? Finally, he faced Richard. And you, Richard, you offered me a job managing a warehouse, a position you felt was appropriate for my reduced station. You stood in this very room and called me nothing. You declared me unfit. You lectured me on being a shark in a world of guppies, all while your own ship was taking on water faster than you knew. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. He was creating a foundation for what was to come, laying each brick of their past transgressions with meticulous care. This was his list of grievances, delivered not with rage, but with the cold, irrefutable clarity of a legal deposition. You have all operated under a series of assumptions, Ethan continued. Assumption 1, that I was fired for incompetence. Assumption 2, that I am financially ruined. Assumption 3, that you are in a position of power and I am in a position of weakness. Every single one of these assumptions is incorrect. Richard let out a short, barking laugh. Oh, this is richer than I thought. The boy's delusions have reached their zenith. Are you going to tell us you're secretly a millionaire, Ethan? That you've been playing some kind of long con? Not a con, Richard, Ethan replied, his voice dropping slightly, becoming quieter and more intense. A strategy, and yes, something like that. He reached into his jacket pocket. The Beaumonts tensed. For a wild moment, they didn't know what to expect. A weapon? A recording device? He pulled out his Lamy 2000 fountain pen. He held it up. You see this pen? To you, it's just a pen. But with this pen, I signed the final transfer of ownership for a company called Argent Trust about 10 weeks ago. Does that name sound familiar, Richard? It should. They are, or rather were, the primary holders of Beaumont Industries' consolidated debt. Richard's face went pale. That's impossible. Argent is a solid institution. It was, Ethan corrected him gently, until its largest shareholders were bought out by a new, more aggressive player in the market. A holding company I established called Ethelred Holdings. As of this morning, Ethelred Holdings is your new banker. All your loans, all your lines of credit, all your corporate debt, it's all owed to me. Gregory stared, his mouth agape. You're lying, am I? Ethan said. He glanced at his watch. In about 5 minutes, your chief financial officer is going to receive an official notification from our legal team. We are calling in the performance review clauses on all your outstanding loans. Given that Beaumont Industries has failed to meet profitability targets for 3 consecutive quarters, we are, under the terms of the agreement you signed, fully entitled to demand immediate repayment or, failing that, to assume control of the company's board of directors. The room was utterly silent, save for the frantic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that suddenly seemed to be counting down the final seconds of the Beaumont's reign. Sophia looked at Ethan, her eyes wide with a dawning, staggering understanding. The quiet phone calls, the spreadsheets, the coded messages, it was all real. He wasn't just surviving, he was conquering. But Ethan wasn't finished. He had saved the quietest, most devastating bomb for last. But that's business, he said, his tone almost conversational. Let's talk about something more personal. This house, for instance, this beautiful, grand, symbolic house. He took a step toward the fireplace, running his hand along the cool marble of the mantelpiece. You were 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank called in the loan. You were desperate. Then a miracle. A silent investor swooped in, bought the note, and gave you new terms. You were so relieved, Richard, you didn't even bother to read the fine print. He turned to face them, and for the first time there was a flicker of something other than calm in his eyes. It was a profound, righteous satisfaction. I am that silent investor. Ethelred Holdings owns the title to this house, every brick, every window, every polished floorboard. It's all mine. He let the statement hang in the air, a simple, devastating, and final truth. So to answer your earlier question, Richard, I'm not here to ask for a price to disappear from your lives. I'm here to tell you the price you'll have to pay to remain in mine. The doorbell rang. The sound, sharp and clear in the stunned silence, made everyone jump. Ethan smiled, a thin, cold smile. Ah, he said, that would be my lawyer, with the paperwork. The silence that followed Ethan's revelation was not merely a lack of sound. It was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the air in the room. The world of the Beaumonts, a universe built on the bedrock of their own perceived superiority, had not just been shaken, it had been inverted. The floor was now the ceiling, and the sky had turned to solid ground. Richard Beaumont, a man whose entire identity was welded to the concepts of power and control, looked as though he had been physically struck. The ruddy, confident color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. The brandy snifter he had been holding slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers and shattered on the marble hearth, the sound unnervously loud in the tomb-like quiet. Eleanor's reaction was different. Her shock manifested as a rigid, statuesque stillness. Her back, always ramrod straight, seemed to become even straighter, as if her sheer force of will could deny the reality of what she had just heard. Only the rapid, frantic blinking of her eyes betrayed the panic storming behind her stoic facade. Gregory was the most transparent. The sneering, cruel mask had evaporated, replaced by the wide-eyed, slack-jawed confusion of a spoiled child who has just been told for the first time that the world does not in fact revolve around him. He looked back and forth between Ethan and his father, as if expecting one of them to announce that this was all an elaborate, tasteless joke. Sophia, standing beside Ethan, was a maelstrom of emotions. There was shock, of course, a dizzying sense of vertigo as she recalibrated her entire understanding of the man she had married. But beneath the shock, a different feeling was bubbling up, a fierce, unexpected surge of pride. She looked at Ethan, at his calm posture and the unwavering steel in his eyes, and she saw not a stranger, but the core of the man she had fallen in love with, the brilliant, patient, principled man who had been hidden beneath a veneer of quiet humility. She had been worried he was a victim. She now understood he was a grandmaster, and they had all been pawns in a game they never even knew they were playing. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. The sound broke the spell. Eleanor flinched. Richard finally found his voice, though it was a raspy, unfamiliar croak. "This is a trick, a lie, some kind of elaborate fraud." "Is it, Richard?" Ethan asked, his voice still maddeningly calm. He walked to the front door himself, a proprietor moving through his own home. He opened it to reveal a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. The man carried a slim leather briefcase. "Mr. Finch," Ethan said, "thank you for coming. I trust you have the documents." "Ethelred," the man replied with a slight respectful nod. The use of the name in front of the family was a deliberate stroke, a final confirmation of Ethan's new identity. "Everything is in order, mister." Finch stepped into the hall and then into the living room, his presence adding a new official layer of gravity to the proceedings. He was the embodiment of sober, irrefutable legality. He placed his briefcase on a polished mahogany side table and opened it with a series of precise clicks. "Mr. Beaumont," Finch began, his voice as dry as old parchment. "I am Alistair Finch, legal counsel for Ethelred Holdings. I have here the deed of title for this property, 142 Willow Creek Drive, registered to my client. I also have the complete debt portfolio for Beaumont Industries, legally acquired from Argent Trust. And finally, he pulled out a single slim file. I have a notice of an emergency board meeting to be held tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., at which time my client will be exercising his right as the primary creditor to restructure the board and assume operational control of the company." He laid the documents out on the table, a neat row of paper that represented the complete and total dismantling of the Beaumont Empire. Each page was a death certificate for their old life. Richard stared at the papers, his eyes wide with horror. He looked at the deed to his house, the house his father had built, the ultimate symbol of his family's ascendancy. His name was nowhere on it. In its place was a corporate entity he had never heard of until 10 minutes ago. It was real. This was all happening. His gaze snapped up to Ethan. The contempt was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate bewilderment. "Why?" he whispered. The single word was a plea. "Why would you do this? To destroy us?" Ethan met his gaze. The moment had arrived, the moral mirror. "Destroy you?" Ethan repeated, the question gentle. "Richard, look at me. When you thought I was a failure, what did you do? You mocked me, you humiliated me, you tried to take my wife away from me. You offered me a demeaning job to lord your power over me. You celebrated my perceived downfall. You acted with cruelty and malice, for no other reason than to feel superior." He took a step closer. "Now look at what I have done. I have acquired your company. I have acquired your home. I have, by your own definition, become the shark. I hold all the power. I can, with a single phone call, have you evicted from this house by morning. I can liquidate your company and sell it for parts, leaving you with nothing. I can do to you, and to your family, exactly what you feared I would do. I can destroy you." He let the possibilities hang in the air, stark and terrifying. He watched the fear bloom in their eyes. "But I won't," he said quietly. The two words were so unexpected they seemed to suck the remaining air out of the room. "This was never about destruction," Ethan continued. "It was about respect. It was about principle. It was a lesson you were clearly incapable of learning any other way. You see, true power, Richard, isn't the ability to crush those weaker than you. It's the restraint you show when you have the ability to do so." He turned to Mr. Finch. "The board meeting is still on for tomorrow, but the agenda has changed. We will not be liquidating. We will be restructuring. And as for this house, he looked around the room at the gaudy symbol of their arrogance. You can stay, for now, but things are going to change. Everything is going to change. The quiet bomb had fully detonated. The shockwaves had subsided, leaving behind the smoking ruins of the Beaumont's world. What Ethan was offering them was not annihilation, but something far more complex and, for them, far more difficult. A chance at a different kind of life, one stripped of the false securities of wealth and status. A life where their survival and dignity would be entirely at his discretion. The reversal of fortune was absolute and complete. The man they had tried to cast into the darkness now owned the light switch, and he was just about to show them what his version of On looked like. The immediate aftermath of the revelation was a study in disintegration. The carefully constructed facades of the Beaumont family crumbled in real time, revealing the fragile, frightened individuals beneath. The power shift was so absolute, so seismically complete, that their minds simply couldn't process it. They cycled through a frantic, pathetic series of emotions: denial, anger, bargaining, and a creeping, terrifying despair. Richard was the first to break completely. The rage and bewilderment curdled into a desperate, pleading subservience that was more horrifying to witness than his arrogance had been. He, a man who had never apologized for anything in his life, stumbled toward Ethan, his hands outstretched not in aggression, but in supplication. "Ethan, son, please," he stammered. The word son, a clumsy, transparent attempt to reestablish a connection that he himself had spent months trying to sever. "There's been a misunderstanding, a terrible misunderstanding. We were just worried about Sophia. We were trying to motivate you. Tough love, you see." It was tough love. The excuse was so flimsy, so patently false that it was insulting. Ethan simply looked at him, his silence a more damning judgment than any accusation. "The company, it's my life's work," Richard continued, his voice cracking. "My father built it. You can't just take it. The house. My grandchildren were meant to play in this garden." Eleanor, seeing her husband's pathetic display, tried a different tactic. She appealed to Sophia, her own daughter, the last remaining leverage she thought she had. She rushed to Sophia's side, grabbing her arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Sophia, darling, you can't let him do this," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for her daughter. "This is your family, your blood. This man, this viper you married, he is trying to tear us apart. You have to stop him. Tell him to stop." Sophia pulled her arm away, the action sharp and decisive. She looked at her mother, at the frantic selfish fear in her eyes. And all the years of intimidation and emotional manipulation coalesced into a single moment of painful clarity. "Stop him?" Sophia's voice was cold, harder than Ethan had ever heard it. "Mother, you are standing in his house. You are begging him not to dismantle the company that you, just hours ago, were using as a weapon to judge him. He is showing more grace and mercy in this moment than you or Dad or Gregory have shown him in the past 6 months. You don't see him as a viper. You see him as a threat to your pride. And you know what? You're right. He is." She turned away from her mother and stood firmly at Ethan's side, her hand finding his. It was no longer a tentative, questioning gesture. It was an anchor. She had made her choice, and she was not wavering. Gregory, who had been silent until now, finally found his voice. But it wasn't a plea or a bargain. It was a final desperate burst of the old Beaumont arrogance. "So that's it," he spat, his face contorted in a sneer that didn't quite mask his fear. "You win. You have it all. The house, the company. You think this makes you a big man? You're still just the pathetic loser who married my sister. You just got lucky with some clever stock market trick. You're not one of us. You'll never be one of us." Mr. Finch, who had been silently observing the family drama with the detached interest of a biologist studying insects, cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, his dry voice cutting through Gregory's tirade, "the clever stock market trick, as you call it, involved the creation of a multinational holding company. The strategic acquisition of a dozen smaller firms across 3 continents to create leverage, and the execution of a hostile takeover of a federally insured financial institution. It was, from a legal and financial standpoint, one of the most brilliant and complex strategic acquisitions I have witnessed in my 30-year career. Your son-in-law is not lucky, Mr. Beaumont. He is a genius. And you, young man," he said, fixing Gregory with a withering gaze, "are a fool." The clinical expert assessment from this impartial, authoritative figure was in many ways the final nail in the coffin. It stripped away their last defense. The idea that Ethan was just a lucky amateur. It confirmed that he was a professional of the highest order, operating on a level they couldn't even comprehend. Ethan let Mr. Finch's words hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "Gregory is right about one thing," he said, causing everyone to look at him in surprise. "I will never be one of you, and you should thank God for that, because if I were, you would be out on the street tonight." He turned to Mr. Finch. "Please, Leave the documents on the table. The Beaumonts will need the night to review them. The meeting is at 9 a.m. in the main conference room of the Beaumont building. I expect you all to be there. On time. The implication was clear. They were now his employees, and he was setting their schedule. He looked at Richard, Eleanor, and Gregory, their faces a ruin of shattered pride. "This is not a punishment," he said, his voice softer now, more like the old Ethan. "This is a second chance, a chance to rebuild, to learn what it means to have real value, not just a high valuation, a chance to earn respect instead of demanding it. Don't waste it." With that, he turned and, with Sophia's hand held firmly in his, walked out of the living room and out of the front door, leaving the three of them standing alone in the vast, silent, and suddenly alien space of a house that was no longer their own. The immediate aftermath was over. The long, difficult process of consequence had just begun. The days and weeks that followed the great revelation were a slow, grinding education in humility for the Beaumont family. The world did not end, but the world they knew certainly did. Ethan was true to his word. He did not destroy them, but he did fundamentally re-engineer their lives. The consequences they faced were not punitive, but they were proportional to their transgressions, a form of poetic justice, so precise it was almost artistic. The 9 a.m. board meeting was the first lesson. Richard, Eleanor, and Gregory arrived not as owners but as chastened subordinates. They found the main conference room, their conference room, already occupied. Ethan was at the head of the table, flanked by Mr. Finch and a team of sharp, focused analysts, the board of Aetherred Holdings. He did not gloat. He was all business. The restructuring was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Richard was removed as CEO. His golden parachute was rescinded, citing clauses in his contract about dereliction of duty and fiscal mismanagement, facts Ethan's team had meticulously documented. He was not, however, fired. Instead, he was given a new title, Senior Advisor for Entrepreneurial Development. His new job, at a fraction of his former salary, was to mentor young, struggling entrepreneurs who received funding from a new charitable wing of the company. He, the man who mocked dreamers, was now tasked with nurturing them. He had to listen to their hopes and fears, help them with their business plans, and treat them with the respect he had never shown Ethan. It was a prison of forced empathy. Gregory was summarily fired from his do-nothing executive position. His corporate credit cards were canceled, his car allowance revoked. Ethan then made him an offer, a job, in the logistics department, managing a warehouse. It was the exact same demeaning offer Richard had made to Ethan, but this time it was real. Gregory, with no other prospects and no trust fund to fall back on, Ethan's company now controlled those trusts as well, was forced to accept. He had to wake up at 5 a.m., wear a hard hat, and learn the value of an honest day's work among the very people his family had always looked down upon. He was no longer a shark. He was, for the first time in his life, a guppy, and he had to learn to swim. Eleanor faced a different kind of consequence. Her vast social budget funded by the company was eliminated. The Beaumont Foundation was completely overhauled. Its focus was shifted from hosting galas to funding impractical, unglamorous community projects. Literacy programs, soup kitchens, job training centers. Eleanor was offered the chance to stay on as a volunteer coordinator. Her job was no longer to schmooze with the wealthy, but to organize food drives and recruit volunteers to read to children in underserved schools. Her social standing, once her source of power, was rendered irrelevant. She had to find a new way to define her worth, one that had nothing to do with the name on an invitation. The mansion was the most potent symbol of their new reality. They were allowed to continue living there, but they were, in essence, tenants. Ethelred Holdings paid for basic upkeep and utilities, but the army of staff, the caterers, the full-time gardeners, the housekeepers, was dismissed. If they wanted the house to be clean, they had to clean it themselves. If they wanted dinner, they had to cook it. The opulent palace became a gilded cage, its vast, empty rooms a constant reminder of the life they had lost and the monumental effort required to maintain it. For Ethan and Sophia, this period was one of delicate reconstruction. They moved out of their small apartment and into a modest but elegant house of their own, one Ethan had designed himself. It was a space defined by light, clean lines, and a sense of peaceful openness, the architectural opposite of the Beaumont mansion. Their relationship, which had been fractured by the pressure of her family, began to heal. They went to counseling, not because they were falling apart, but because they wanted to build something stronger. In the therapist's office, Sophia finally confronted the ways in which she had been a silent enabler, the ways her fear of her family's disapproval had made her complicit in their cruelty. "I was a coward," she admitted one session, tears streaming down her face. "I saw what they were doing to you, and I stood by and let it happen. I was so afraid of losing my place in their world that I risked losing my place in yours." Ethan took her hand. You were conditioned, he said, his voice full of understanding, not accusation. Your entire life, their love and approval were transactional. You were taught that your worth was tied to your status. It's a hard thing to unlearn. But you knew, she said, looking at him with wonder. You knew your own worth, even when they were all telling you that you had none. How? Ethan thought for a moment. Because I'm an architect, he said simply. I know that the most important part of any structure is the foundation. It's not the flashy facade or the fancy decorations. It's the part no one sees. My parents taught me to build a strong foundation for myself, based on integrity, hard work, and self-respect. What your family built was a beautiful facade with no foundation at all. It was always going to collapse. I just happened to be the one to push on it. The choice Sophia had made in that living room had been the first block in her own new foundation. By choosing to stand with Ethan, she had chosen integrity over status, love over transaction, and in doing so, she had begun the process of becoming the person he had always believed she could be. The consequences for her family were harsh, but the consequences for her were liberating. She was finally free. The new dynamics were established, not by force, but by the undeniable gravity of truth. Months turned into a year. The changes initially resisted began to take root in unexpected ways. The new reality, stripped of its artifice, forced the Beaumonts to confront themselves, and the results were slowly, painfully transformative. Richard at first went through the motions of his new job with bitter resentment. He saw the young entrepreneurs as pathetic, needy versions of the man who had humbled him. But one day, a young woman, a brilliant software engineer with a revolutionary idea but crippling social anxiety, reminded him of a younger Sophia. He found himself, much to his own surprise, genuinely wanting to help her succeed. He gave her advice not from a place of superiority, but from a place of hard-won experience. He taught her how to be confident in a boardroom, how to negotiate a contract. When her company secured its first round of major funding, she thanked him with tears in her eyes. For the first time in decades, Richard felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with his own net worth. It was a small, fragile shoot of redemption, but it was growing. Gregory's transformation was more visceral. The physical labor of the warehouse exhausted and humbled him. He was no longer Gregory Beaumont, the heir apparent. He was just Greg, the new guy who didn't know how to operate a forklift. He was mocked for his soft hands and his cluelessness. He was, for the first time, the butt of the joke. One day, during a lunch break, one of the veteran workers, a man named Hector, sat down with him. Hector had worked for Beaumont Industries for 20 years and had seen Gregory grow up from a distance. You know, Hector said, unwrapping a sandwich, your old man, the first Mr. Beaumont, your granddad, he used to spend 1 week a year working on the floor. Said he couldn't run a company if he didn't know how the engine worked. Your father never did that. The comment was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. But it struck Gregory with profound force. He started to listen more and talk less. He learned the names of the people he worked with, learned about their families, their struggles, their hopes. He learned how the engine of the company actually worked. He was still arrogant and often difficult, but a new kind of respect was being forged in him, hammered out on the anvil of manual labor. Eleanor's journey was the quietest and perhaps the most profound. Stripped of her social calendar, she was left with silence and time. At first, she rattled around the giant, empty mansion like a ghost. Then, out of sheer boredom, she started tending to the gardens herself. She found a peace in the soil, in the simple, honest work of nurturing life. She started volunteering at the library her foundation was now funding. She sat with children who were struggling to read, her famous diction and poise now used not for social climbing, but for patiently sounding out words. She discovered a joy in contributing something real, something that couldn't be measured in dollars or social cachet. Ethan and Sophia watched these changes from a respectful distance. They never lorded their position over the family. They would attend holiday dinners at the mansion, dinners the Beaumonts now cooked themselves. The food was simpler, but the conversations were more genuine. The brittle laughter was replaced by something warmer, more authentic. One Christmas Eve, after a quiet, pleasant dinner, Ethan found himself alone with Richard on the terrace. The air was cold and crisp. The company, it's doing well, Richard said, breaking the silence. The new direction, it's solid, profitable. It's built on a better foundation, Ethan replied. Richard nodded, staring out into the darkness. I was wrong about you, Ethan. I was wrong about everything. I judged you by my own broken ruler. I am sorry. The apology, when it finally came, was quiet, unadorned, and utterly sincere. It held no agenda, no request for forgiveness. It was simply a statement of truth. I know, Richard, Ethan said. He placed a hand on his father-in-law's shoulder. I know. Later that evening, as he and Sophia drove home, she snuggled against him in the car. You did it, she whispered. You didn't just win. You made them better. Ethan shook his head slightly. I didn't do it, he said. I just gave them the opportunity to do it themselves. I built a new structure for their lives, but they were the ones who had to choose to live in it. Real change, like a good building, has to be built from the inside out. His story is a powerful reminder that true worth is not measured by wealth, status, or the approval of others. It's measured by integrity, resilience, and the quiet strength of one's own character. It's about building a life with a foundation so strong that it can withstand any storm, even when others are hoping for its collapse. It's a lesson in the difference between being rich and being valuable. What do you think? Was Ethan's response justified? Or was it a form of revenge, just more elegantly executed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read everyone. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found value in this story, please consider liking and subscribing for more tales of justice, redemption, and the quiet triumph of the underestimated. Until next time, remember to check your own foundations. They're the most valuable thing you'll ever build.